Chapter 1. Shadows in the Orchard. The Yakima Valley basked under the pale light of the waning moon, casting long shadows over the rows of plum trees. Old Man Richard leaned against the creaky wooden fence, his gaze fixed on his once thriving orchard. The sight that met him every morning for the past 2 weeks gnawed at his sanity. Plums gone. Not a trace of fruit left on the branches, despite his every effort to catch the thief. Damn kids, he muttered to himself, though the words lacked conviction. It didn't add up. No footprints, no broken branches, not even a dropped fruit to hint at the culprits. Just the trees standing tall and bare, swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking him. Determined to put an end to this madness, Richard had spent what little savings he had on a set of surveillance cameras and motion sensors. He'd positioned them strategically around the orchard and spent nights reviewing the footage, only to find nothing but an unbroken stretch of eerie silence. The sensors triggered, yet not a single frame showed any sign of movement. He stared at the grove of plum trees, shrouded in the silver veil of moonlight. There was something unnerving about the way they loomed, as if watching him back. Swallowing his apprehension, Richard turned and made his way to the small shed by the farmhouse. He would spend another sleepless night poring over the feeds. Maybe this time he'd catch a glimpse of whatever, or whoever, was stealing his fruit. The hours dragged by, and Richard's eyes grew heavy as he cycled through the camera feeds for what felt like the 100th time. The orchard remained still, the shadows unchanged. He was on the verge of dozing off when the motion sensors blared to life, jolting him upright. Heart pounding, he scrambled to the monitor, expecting to see a raccoon or perhaps one of the neighbor's kids. But the screens showed nothing. He flipped through the feeds again, sweat beading on his forehead. Still nothing. And yet the sensors continued to flash wildly, as if something unseen was moving through the trees. What the hell? He breathed, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the camera's angles. The grainy night vision footage revealed only the dark outlines of the trees, swaying softly. Richard's frustration flared, but before he could curse aloud he noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off a summer road. He leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The shimmer moved between the trees, darting from one branch to the next. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was too small to be a person. And too fast. The sensors continued their relentless flashing as the shimmer weaved through the orchard. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The sensors went quiet, leaving Richard alone with the empty night and the droning silence of the monitor. Slumping back in his chair, he stared at the screens, a cold dread settling over him. Something was out there, something he couldn't see, something that moved with a purpose. He reached for the phone, hesitating before dialing the familiar number. "Marie," he said when his daughter's voice crackled through the line. "It's happening again. I need your help." There was a pause, then a reluctant sigh. "I'll be there in the morning, Dad," she replied softly. "Try to get some sleep." Richard hung up, his gaze drifting back to the dark orchard beyond the window. Sleep was the last thing on his mind. Chapter 2. The Unseen Culprit. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the valley, painting the orchards in muted hues of gold and green. Marie's car rumbled down the gravel road leading to her father's farmhouse, dust trailing behind her like a restless ghost. She hadn't been back in years, not since their last falling out. Now, as she glanced at the familiar silhouette of the barn and the rows of plum trees beyond, a mix of nostalgia and unease tightened in her chest. Richard stood by the porch, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face etched deeper, his hair thinner and whiter. He raised a hand in a hesitant wave as Marie pulled up, and she managed to smile in return. "Hey Dad," she greeted, stepping out of the car. "Look, well, it was a lie, but the truth felt too cruel." Richard grunted, his gaze flicking past her to the orchard. "You saw the messages I sent?" She nodded, following his gaze. The trees seemed ordinary enough in the daylight, their branches heavy with green leaves. Yet a lingering tension hung in the air, a sense that something was off-kilter. "I watched the footage you emailed me. There's something strange going on, but I didn't see any clear intruders." "Because it's not people," Richard said grimly. He beckoned her to follow as he walked toward the orchard. "There's something else out there. Something I can't explain. But I know it's taking the plums." Marie fell into step beside him, studying his face. She'd seen that look before, the obsessive glint in his eyes, the tight set of his jaw. It was the same look he'd worn when he insisted the government was poisoning their well water, or when he claimed to see lights in the sky no one else could see. "Dad, I'm here to help," she said gently. "But I need you to be honest with me. Are you taking your medication?" He scowled, brushing off her concern with a wave of his hand. This isn't about me losing my marbles, Marie. I'm telling you, there's something in that orchard. He led her to the first row of plum trees, where the ground was littered with small pits and stems, the only remnants of the stolen fruit. Marie knelt and picked up a pit, turning it over in her fingers. It was clean, almost polished. Not a shred of fruit left on it. If it's animals, they're not leaving much behind, she murmured. It's not animals, Richard insisted. He pointed to a nearby tree. Look up there. Marie straightened and peered at the tree's branches. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then she saw it. A faint, silvery residue clinging to the bark. It shimmered in the morning light, like a fine web spun from metallic threads. What the? She reached up, touching the substance. It felt slick and cold against her skin, leaving a tingling sensation in its wake. I found that on a lot of the trees, Richard said. It wasn't there before. Started showing up a couple of weeks ago, around the same time the plums began disappearing. Marie rubbed the residue between her thumb and forefinger, a strange thought forming in the back of her mind. It's almost like a secretion, or a sap maybe? But it doesn't look like anything I've seen in plants before. She pulled out a plastic bag from her satchel and scraped some of the residue into it. I'll take this back to my lab and run some tests. Richard's shoulders sagged, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. You believe me then? I believe something unusual is happening, she said carefully. But I still think we need more evidence before jumping to conclusions. They spent the rest of the morning inspecting the orchard. Marie took more samples, soil, leaves and bark, all of which showed signs of abnormality. The soil was unusually dry, despite the regular irrigation schedule, and the leaves had a strange, glossy sheen to them. As they moved deeper into the orchard, the sense of unease grew stronger, as if the air itself were charged with a barely perceptible hum. Dad, has anything else changed? She asked. Anything at all? Richard hesitated, then nodded. The trees, they've started making noises at night. Like creaking or groaning. It's subtle, but I can hear it from the house. And sometimes when I'm out here alone. He trailed off, his eyes darting nervously to the shadowed spaces between the trees. What? Marie pressed, lowering her voice. It feels like something's watching me. I know how it sounds, but I can't shake the feeling. Every time I come out here it's like the orchard itself is alive. Marie stared at him, her heart sinking. This was worse than she thought. But before she could respond, Richard turned and pointed to a patch of disturbed earth at the base of one of the trees. There, look at that. Marie crouched beside the tree and frowned. The soil was churned up as if something had been digging. But there were no tracks, no sign of paws or hooves. Just a strange, swirling pattern in the dirt. It's almost like something was burrowing, she mused aloud. Richard nodded vigorously. Exactly. I've seen it under several trees. Whatever's doing this, it's not just taking the fruit. It's affecting the trees themselves. They exchanged a troubled glance. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew plant biology inside and out, but this defied explanation. She needed more data, more samples. But above all, she needed to keep Richard grounded. Let's set up some new equipment, she said finally. Motion detectors, thermal cameras, the works. If there's something here, we'll catch it. Richard's face tightened with determination. And if we don't? Marie swallowed. Then we'll find another way. But we're not giving up. They spent the afternoon setting up the equipment, high-resolution cameras with night vision capabilities, thermal sensors, and even a few sound recorders to capture the noises Richard claimed to hear. By the time they were finished, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the orchard. Let's go back to the house and review everything, Marie suggested. We can monitor the feeds from there. Richard nodded absently, his gaze lingering on the darkening grove. I have a feeling tonight's going to be different, he murmured. Marie glanced at him sharply. What do you mean? He shook his head, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Just a feeling. They headed back to the farmhouse, the equipment humming softly as it recorded every rustle of leaves, every faint breeze. And as they settled in to wait for nightfall, Marie couldn't shake the sense that her father was right. Something was coming. And whatever it wasn't going to be satisfied with just a few plums. Chapter 3. Lights Among the Branches. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned as the evening wind picked up, brushing against the windows with ghostly fingers. Inside, Richard and Marie huddled around a flickering array of monitors, the glow casting harsh shadows across their tired faces. The cameras had been rolling for hours now, and the feeds showed nothing but the dark silhouettes of the plum trees swaying gently in the wind. Marie's eyes ached from staring at the screens, but she refused to look away. She'd promised her father she'd help, and she intended to keep that promise, no matter how fruitless it seemed. "Anything yet?" Richard asked, his voice low and strained. Marie shook her head, suppressing a yawn. "No, just the usual. Branches moving, a few bugs flying by, but nothing substantial." She glanced at the thermal imaging feed. "The temperature fluctuations are odd, though. It's cooler out there than it should be for this time of night." Richard frowned, leaning closer to peer at the screen. "How much cooler?" "By almost 10 degrees, she replied, her brow furrowing. "It's like something is sapping the heat out of the air. Or maybe the ground." She bit her lip thoughtfully. "If these things are drawing energy from the environment, it could explain why the trees are suffering." "Yeah, but why plums?" Richard muttered, more to himself than to her. "Why not apples or pears? Why not the damn weeds, for that matter?" Marie didn't have an answer. She reached for her thermos of coffee, took a long sip, and tried to ignore the growing unease gnawing at the back of her mind. The orchard loomed large on the screen, an endless procession of trees stretching into the dark. It felt like they were staring into a living, breathing creature, one that could see them just as clearly as they saw it. They sat in tense silence for another hour, the house ticking and settling around them. Then, just as Marie was about to suggest taking a break, a motion sensor's alarm went off with a sharp, grating buzz. Richard jumped, his hand knocking over an empty cup. Coffee-stained paper towels scattered across the floor as he scrambled to silence the alarm. "Look," he whispered hoarsely, jabbing a finger at the monitor. "There, something's moving." Marie leaned forward, her heart hammering. On the far left feed, where the trees stood densely packed together, a strange, shimmering blur flitted through the frame. It darted between the branches, barely more than a smudge of light against the darkness, but undeniably there. "What the hell is that?" she murmured. Richard fumbled with the controls, zooming in on the spot. The image sharpened and Marie sucked in a breath. The blur resolved into a cluster of faint, luminescent shapes, no larger than a fist. They hovered in midair, their outlines rippling like water disturbed by an unseen current. The creatures, if they could be called that, seemed to vibrate with energy, their bodies glowing softly with a bluish-white light. They moved in perfect synchronicity, weaving around the tree trunks and branches in a graceful, almost dance-like pattern. Marie counted at least half a dozen, maybe more, their numbers fluctuating as they zipped in and out of the camera's view. "Are those bugs?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too big to be insects," Marie replied, shaking her head. "And I've never seen insects behave like that. They're moving with a purpose, almost like they're communicating with each other." As they watched, the glowing shapes clustered around a particularly tall plum tree. One by one, they floated closer to the branches, tiny tendrils of light extending from their bodies to touch the fruit. The plums, still green and unripe, began to glow as well, their surfaces pulsing faintly in rhythm with the creature's movements. "It's like they're feeding off the plums," Marie breathed. "Or maybe they're doing something to the fruit." The minutes ticked by as they observed the strange creature's meticulous work. The plum's glow intensified, shifting from a faint glimmer to a steady, throbbing light. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the process stopped. The creatures drew back, their tendrils retracting, and the plum's glow faded into darkness. "What just happened?" Richard whispered, his face pale. Marie shook her head at a loss. "I don't know. But it looked like they were." The creatures suddenly darted away from the tree, scattering in all directions. Richard cursed under his breath, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he tried to track them. One by one, the glowing shapes vanished from the feeds, slipping out of sight like smoke dissipating in the wind. "Damn it," he growled. "Where'd they go?" Marie's eyes flicked to the thermal feed. The area around the tree was still, the temperature returning to its previous abnormal low. She reached for the audio recorder, rewinding it to the moment the creatures had appeared. As she played back the recording, a soft, high-pitched hum filled the room, a sound almost too faint to hear. "That's them," she murmured, adjusting the volume. "They were making this noise the whole time." "It's almost like a signal," Richard said slowly. "Some kind of communication." Marie nodded. "Or maybe it's how they manipulate the fruit. We need more information." She glanced at her father. "You're right, there's something out there. But we still don't know what it wants or why it's targeting your orchard." Richard stared at the screen, his face a mask of determination and fear. "We're not letting them get away with it. I don't care if they're bugs or aliens or goddamn ghosts. We need to stop them." "Agreed," Marie said softly. "But we have to be careful. Whatever they're doing, it's affecting the trees, the soil, maybe even the air. If we confront them, it could make things worse. So what do we do? Richard demanded. We keep observing, she replied. We collect more data. And we find out exactly what they're doing to those plums. I'll analyze the residue I collected and compare it to the fruit samples. Maybe it'll give us a clue. Richard clenched his fists, his jaw set in a hard line. I don't like sitting on my hands. But if that's what it takes, fine. Trust me, Dad, Marie said gently. We're going to figure this out. Together. They spent the rest of the night monitoring the feeds, but the glowing creatures didn't return. As dawn broke, painting the orchard in a soft, hazy light, Marie rose from her chair, her muscles stiff and aching. Let's get some sleep, she said, placing a hand on her father's shoulder. We can check the equipment and review the recordings again later. Richard nodded reluctantly, his eyes still fixed on the monitors. Hey, but something tells me we're running out of time, Marie. Whatever those things are, they're getting bolder. Marie didn't disagree. She glanced back at the darkened orchard one last time before following her father out of the room. The orchard seemed to watch them leave, the trees casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like grasping fingers. And somewhere, deep among the branches, something pulsed faintly, an almost imperceptible light, waiting for nightfall to come again. Chapter 4. Invasion of the Unknown. The house was eerily quiet when Marie awoke. No birds chirped outside, no distant hum of tractors or farm equipment from the neighboring properties. She sat up in bed, the silence pressing in on her like a weight. A chill seeped through the air, unusual for late summer in the valley. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she moved to the window and peered out. The orchard stood shrouded in mist, the morning light muted and dull. The trees looked almost skeletal, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers clawing at the sky. A shiver ran down her spine. There was something malevolent about the way the mist pooled around the trunks, swirling lazily as if with a mind of its own. Marie hurriedly dressed and made her way downstairs. She found her father already in the kitchen, hunched over a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes were dark and sunken, and his hands trembled slightly as he looked up at her. "Morning," he murmured. "Did you sleep?" "Not much," she admitted, pouring herself a fresh cup. "I kept thinking about what we saw last night." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been thinking too. Whatever those things are, they're getting braver. They used to take just a few plums, but now, they're getting bolder. Taking more. And it's affecting the trees." Marie took a sip of her coffee. "I ran some initial tests on the residue we collected. It's not a secretion. It's more like a byproduct. A reaction maybe. I can't explain it, but whatever those things are doing, it's changing the chemical composition of the plants." Richard's gaze sharpened. "Changing how?" "The leaves are developing a metallic sheen, and the bark is becoming brittle. The soil near the roots is acidic. More than it should be. It's like the trees are rejecting the earth they're planted in. Or, something's making them do it." She hesitated, then added, "And the fruit that was glowing last night? It's been altered on a cellular level. I can't even classify some of the cells I found. It's evolving. Mutating." Richard stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and fear flickering across his face. "Mutating? You mean the plums?" "Yes," Marie said grimly. "And if it's happening to the plums, it could spread to the other plants, the other orchards. Maybe even beyond that." The room fell silent, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Finally, Richard pushed back his chair and stood. "Then we need to act," he said firmly. "Tonight we confront them." "Confront them?" Marie blinked. "Dad, we don't even know what they are, let alone how dangerous they might be. We need more information." "We don't have time for more information," he snapped, then took a deep breath, his expression softening. "Look, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I can't just sit here and watch those things destroy my orchard. Our family's orchard. We have to do something." Marie clenched her jaw, torn between the need for caution and her father's desperation. "Hey, but we're going to do this smart, all right? No rushing in and getting yourself hurt." Richard nodded curtly, and they spent the rest of the day preparing for the night to come. They gathered tools, flashlights, a few makeshift weapons, and additional cameras to set up closer to the trees. Marie also packed a small kit with syringes and sample containers, hoping to collect more residue or even one of the creatures if the opportunity presented itself. As dusk fell, the tension in the air grew thicker. They moved through the orchard with the care of soldiers entering enemy territory, every rustle of leaves and crack of a twig making them flinch. "Set the cameras here," Marie whispered, pointing to a large tree near the center of the orchard. "We want to get a clear view of the entire area." Richard nodded, his face a mask of concentration as he worked. The tree they were standing near was the same one they'd seen the creatures converge on last night. Its branches were twisted and bare in places. The bark split open in several places, leaking a thick sap-like substance that shimmered faintly. "Look at this," Marie murmured, running her fingers along the bark. It's almost like the tree's bleeding. Bleeding, Richard echoed, shaking his head. God help us. With the cameras set up and the sensors recalibrated, they retreated to a small shed at the edge of the orchard. It offered a clear view of the trees without putting them in immediate danger. They watched the monitors in silence as the night deepened and shadows pooled beneath the trees. Then just past midnight the sensors flared to life. There, Richard hissed, pointing at the screen. Marie's breath caught in her throat. The glowing shapes were back. Dozens of them, far more than they'd seen the previous night. They drifted through the orchard like wraiths, their movements smooth and coordinated. The camera feeds captured them from multiple angles, showing the full extent of their presence. God, there's so many of them, Marie whispered. The creatures clustered around the same tree they'd focused on last night. Marie watched, transfixed, as they extended their tendrils once more, touching the tree's bark and fruit. But this time they didn't stop there. The tendrils penetrated the bark, sinking deep into the wood, and the tree shuddered violently, its branches jerking and twisting. What are they doing? Richard breathed. I don't know, but it's not good, Marie replied, her voice tight. The tree's bark began to split apart, cracks spreading outward from where the creatures were attached. The sap-like substance leaked out in thick rivulets, glowing faintly in the dark. Then with a sharp crack one of the branches snapped off, crashing to the ground. Marie jumped, her heart hammering. They're killing the tree. Richard's face twisted with fury. He grabbed the flashlight and yanked open the shed door before Marie could stop him. Dad, wait, she hissed, but he was already marching toward the tree, his jaw clenched in determination. The creatures froze as the beam of the flashlight swept over them. For a heartbeat, everything was still, then they scattered, shooting up into the air like a burst of fireflies. They hovered just out of reach, their glowing bodies pulsating with a strange, erratic rhythm. Get away from my trees! Richard shouted, waving the flashlight at them. The creatures reacted instantly. Several of them swooped down, circling around Richard's head in a tight formation. He stumbled back, swatting at them with his free hand. The creature's light flared brighter, blindingly bright, and Marie screamed as she saw her father collapse to his knees, his face twisted in pain. Dad, she shouted, running toward him. The creatures swirled around Richard like a living vortex, their light intensifying until he was completely obscured. Marie felt a surge of panic. She couldn't see him, couldn't reach him. Leave him alone, she cried, grabbing a broken tree branch and swinging it wildly at the creatures. The branch passed through them as if they were made of mist, but they drew back, their lights flickering. Dad, get up, she pleaded, dropping to her knees beside him. Richard groaned, his face pale and drawn. The creatures hovered above them for a moment longer, then as if in response to some silent command, they shot back into the trees and vanished into the darkness. Marie sagged in relief, her hands shaking as she helped her father to his feet. Are you okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard nodded weakly. Yeah, I think so. What were you thinking? She demanded, her fear turning to anger. You could have been killed. I had to do something, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Couldn't just watch. Marie bit back a retort and looked around. The orchard was still, the creatures gone. But the damage had been done. The tree they'd attacked was now a lifeless husk, its bark charred and cracked. We need to go back, she said quietly. We have to regroup and figure out what to do next. Richard nodded reluctantly and they made their way back to the shed. As Marie glanced over her shoulder one last time, she saw a faint light flickering deep among the trees. The creatures hadn't left. They were watching. Waiting. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, with thick clouds blotting out the sun. Marie could feel the weight of the previous night pressing down on her, and from the way Richard moved sluggishly around the kitchen, it was clear he felt it too. His hand still shook when he tried to lift his coffee mug, and his eyes held a haunted, distant look that sent a stab of fear through her heart. We can't go on like this, Marie said softly. If we confront them again without knowing what we're up against, you could end up seriously hurt. Or worse. Richard didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands, turning them over as if searching for some hidden truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. I thought I could scare them off, he murmured. Thought maybe they'd leave if they knew we were watching. He gave a bitter laugh. But it's like they didn't even care. Like I was just in the way. Marie reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. We're going to find out what they want, Dad. We'll figure this out. But we need help. Help. Richard snorted, shaking his head. From who? The sheriff thinks I'm crazy. The neighbors don't want to get involved. We're alone in this, Marie. Maybe, Marie said slowly. But we're not the first ones to see something strange here, are we? Richard looked up sharply. What do you mean? I've been thinking about what you told me, Marie continued. About those stories Grandpa used to tell. The lights in the sky, the strange things happening in the fields. And then there's Marv. Richard frowned. Marv. Your neighbor, Marie reminded him. You said he used to talk about seeing strange things in the valley. I think it's time we paid him a visit. Richard hesitated, his expression darkening. Marv's not well. Hasn't been for a long time. People say he's crazy, even more so than me. Marie squeezed his hand again. That might be true. But what if he's seen these things before? What if he knows something we don't? Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. I don't know, Marie. It's been years since I talked to him. Last I heard he wasn't leaving his place much. Keeps to himself. But he paused, then nodded slowly. It's worth a shot. We'll go see him. The drive to Marv's house took them deeper into the valley, where the roads narrowed and the trees grew denser. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Marie kept her eyes on the winding road, but Richard's gaze drifted to the woods on either side, his expression growing more strained the farther they drove. Marv used to have one of the best orchards in the valley, Richard said quietly. Apples mostly. People came from miles around to buy his fruit. Then one year, something happened. He stopped tending the trees. Just let them rot. Folks said he'd lost his mind. But I always wondered. Wondered what? Marie asked gently. If he saw something, Richard replied. Something that made him give up. They rounded a bend and Marv's house came into view. It was a ramshackle old farmhouse, sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were boarded up and the yard was choked with weeds. A rusty mailbox leaned precariously to one side, the name Marvin J. Connors barely legible beneath a thick layer of grime. Marie parked the car and they climbed out, their footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. Richard hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, then squared his shoulders and knocked on the door. For a long time, there was no sound but the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then from somewhere inside the house came the slow creak of floorboards. Who's there? A voice called out, hoarse and rasping like dry leaves rustling over a gravel path. It's Richard Mason, Richard called back. I'm here with my daughter Marie. We need to talk to you, Marv. Another long pause. Marie held her breath, glancing nervously at her father. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back echoed through the still air, and the door swung open just enough for a weathered face to peer out. Marv looked even worse than Marie had imagined. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his skull, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. A scraggly beard covered his chin, and his clothes hung loosely from his thin frame, as if he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. He blinked at them, his gaze darting from Richard to Marie and back again. Richard Mason, he muttered. Haven't seen you in a long time. Yeah, Richard said quietly. I know. I'm sorry. Marv snorted, then his gaze narrowed. What do you want? Richard hesitated, then glanced at Marie. She stepped forward, offering Marv a tentative smile. Mr. Connors, we need your help, she said softly. There's something happening in our orchard. Something unnatural. Marv's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear passing over his face. He opened the door a little wider, his gaze searching Marie's. You've seen them? Marie nodded. Yes, we've seen them. They're taking the fruit, changing the trees. We don't know what they are or what they want. But we need to find out. Marv stared at her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. He opened the door fully and gestured for them to come in. All right, he muttered. But you're not gonna like what I have to say. The inside of Marv's house was dark and cluttered, the air stale and thick. Newspapers and magazines were stacked in uneven piles along the walls, and a musty odor hung in the air. Marv led them to a small, dimly lit living room and motioned for them to sit on a threadbare couch. He settled into an armchair opposite them, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. They come for the fruit, he said abruptly, blowing out a thin stream of smoke. Always have. Not every year. Sometimes they don't show up for decades. But when they do, it's bad news. What are they? Marie asked, leaning forward. Marv's gaze flicked to the boarded-up windows, then back to her. Don't know what they are. Nobody does. But they're not from around here, that's for damn sure. Richard frowned. You mean, not from Earth? Marv shrugged, taking another drag of his cigarette. Could be. Or maybe they're from somewhere else. Another dimension, maybe. I don't know. But I've seen 'em. Watched 'em strip an orchard clean in one night. After that, the trees died. The ground went bad. Nothing grew there again. It's like they poison everything they touch. Marie's heart sank. That's what's happening to our trees. The soil's changing and the fruit, it's mutating. Marv nodded grimly. Yeah, that sounds about right. You can't fight 'em. You can try, but it won't work. Best you can do is leave. Pack up and get the hell out of here before they decide to take more than just your fruit. Richard shook his head stubbornly. No, this is our land. Our home. I'm not running away. Marv's eyes softened, a trace of pity in his gaze. I said the same thing once. Lost everything because of it. They took my trees, my land, even my wife. She started getting sick right after they showed up. Doctors couldn't figure it out. But I knew it was them. Marie's breath caught. She died. Marv nodded slowly. Yeah. And when she was gone, they left. Just like that. Packed up and moved on. But they'll be back. Always come back. A heavy silence fell over the room. Marv looked down at his trembling hands, his voice a ragged whisper. If you stay, you'll lose everything. I don't want that for you, Richard. Or your daughter. Richard swallowed hard, his face pale and strained. What do they want, Marv? Why do they do this? Marv shook his head, his gaze distant. Don't know. Maybe it's just what they are. Maybe they're testing us or preparing the land for something else. I stopped asking those questions a long time ago. All I know is when they come, nothing good follows. Marie leaned back, her mind spinning. The creatures weren't just stealing plums. They were poisoning the land, spreading sickness and death wherever they went. If they didn't find a way to stop them, the entire valley could be at risk. What do we do? She asked quietly. Marv's gaze met hers, filled with sorrow and resignation. You do what I couldn't. You leave. Richard shook his head again, more forcefully this time. No, we're not leaving. We'll find a way to stop them. Marv sighed and stubbed out his cigarette, his shoulders slumping. Then I'll pray for you, Richard. 'Cause you're gonna need all the help you can get. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Marie felt a cold dread settle over her heart. She didn't want to admit it, but Marv was right. They were in way over their heads. And if they stayed, they might not live to see the orchard bloom again. Chapter 6. A Family's Secret. Back at the farmhouse, the weight of Marv's warnings pressed down on them like a heavy shroud. Richard sat slumped at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Marie paced back and forth, her mind racing through everything Marv had said. There was a kernel of truth to his madness. A grim reality they were facing alone. They couldn't just run, but they also couldn't fight a force that they barely understood. Dad, Marie began slowly, we need to find out why they're targeting our orchard specifically. Why our land? You heard what Marv said, they've been coming here for generations. And Grandpa, don't, Richard cut her off sharply, his voice raw. Don't bring him into this. Marie stopped mid-stride, blinking in surprise. Why not? Dad, you know more than you're telling me. I need to know what you're hiding. If you know something about why they're here, you have to tell me. Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. There's nothing to tell, he muttered. Bullshit, Marie snapped, anger flaring. I'm tired of this, Dad. You called me here, dragged me into this mess. If you want my help, you need to be honest with me. What really happened with Grandpa? What was he involved in? Richard's face went pale, his lips tightening into a thin line. For a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. Then he let out a shuddering breath, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. All right, fine, he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. You want the truth? It's not gonna help, but I'll tell you what I know. He stood abruptly, crossing the room to an old cabinet by the wall. Marie watched as he fumbled with a key on his keychain and unlocked the top drawer. From within he pulled out a battered shoebox, its lid held together with a fraying rubber band. Richard hesitated, his gaze flickering to Marie's face, before he set the box on the table. What's this? Marie asked, her curiosity piqued. Richard didn't answer immediately. He removed the lid and began to pull out a collection of faded photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings and brittle letters, placing them carefully on the table. Your grandfather, Richard said slowly. He was more than just a farmer. He was a little obsessed. Not just with the orchard but with what he called the Watchers. He picked up one of the photographs and held it out to Marie. It showed her grandfather standing beside one of the old plum trees, much younger than she remembered him. His gaze was intense, almost wild, and there was something unsettling about the way he stood, as if he were guarding the tree against an unseen threat. In the background, several dark shapes hovered at the edge of the frame, indistinct and shadowy. Marie frowned. What are those? Richard swallowed hard. He believed they were beings, guardians or maybe invaders. It was hard to tell even for him. All I know is he saw them first when he was a boy, and when he inherited the orchard he spent years trying to understand what they were. Marie's fingers brushed over the old newspaper clippings. Headlines jumped out at her. Mysterious lights over the valley, local farmer claims alien encounter, tragedy strikes Mason family orchard. The articles painted a picture of a man who had been tormented by the unknown. They mentioned sightings of strange lights in the sky, unexplained crop failures, and livestock that went missing without a trace. The older Richard grew, the more people in town began to see him as a local oddity, a madman chasing shadows. The whispers had never really died down. Everyone thought he was crazy, Richard said softly. including me. But then one night when I was about your age, I saw them too. Marie's breath caught. You saw them? The same creatures we've been seeing? Richard nodded slowly, his gaze distant. Not as many. Just a few. They were smaller then, I think. Or maybe I was just bigger, less scared. But they were the same. Glowing, flitting through the trees, taking the fruit. He paused, his brow furrowing. I tried to tell your grandpa, but he already knew. Said it was why we kept the orchard going, why we kept the land in the family. Why? Marie whispered, dread coiling in her stomach. Because they're connected to it, Richard said quietly. Somehow the land calls to them. Or they're drawn to it. Your grandpa thought it was because of the soil. Something unique about the minerals, the way the land reacts to the water from the underground springs. He tried everything to disrupt them, change the crops, even tried setting traps. But they always came back. Marie sifted through the letters, her eyes skimming over her grandfather's tight, cramped handwriting. Words and phrases jumped out at her. Vibrational frequencies, plumstone core mutation, extra-dimensional presence. Dad, these letters. Grandpa was studying them, she murmured, glancing up at him. Like a scientist. He wasn't just afraid of them, he was trying to understand them. Richard nodded. He thought if he could figure out what they were doing he could stop them. Or at least control them. But then your grandma got sick. The doctors said it was a rare form of cancer. But he didn't believe that. He thought it was the creatures. He said they were changing the land, the air, and that it was poisoning her. Marie swallowed hard, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening clarity. He blamed them for her death. Richard's gaze was haunted. He went mad after that. Started trying to burn the trees down, said it was the only way to get rid of them. But every time he set fire to one part of the orchard, they'd show up somewhere else, stronger than before. In the end he gave up. Sold off half the land to the neighbors and locked himself in the house. He never spoke about it again. And you never thought to tell me any of this? Marie demanded, her voice rising. I thought it was all over. Richard burst out. I thought they were gone for good. After your grandpa passed they didn't come back. The orchard was normal for years. No strange lights, no missing fruit. Just normal. So I didn't say anything. I didn't want you to grow up afraid of your own home. Marie stared at him, her heart pounding. But they weren't gone, were they? They were just waiting. Richard's shoulders sagged. I guess so. When they came back a few weeks ago I thought it was just animals at first. But then I started seeing the lights again, feeling that same cold dread. That's when I knew, whatever Grandpa tried to do didn't work. They're here for something, Marie. And I'm scared they're not going to leave this time. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. Marie looked down at the letters, at her grandfather's desperate, scribbled notes. There were references to geological surveys, chemical analyses, and something called Node K. She picked up one of the letters, her brow furrowing as she read aloud. Node K shows anomalous readings, potential access point or anchor site. Recommend further investigation with specialized equipment. Hypothesis. Plumstone mutation indicates preliminary phase of incursion. Containment measures failed. Recommend termination protocol. What's Node K? She asked, looking up at Richard. I don't know, he admitted. Your grandpa never told me. I think it's somewhere on the property though. He used to go out there sometimes carrying equipment. Wouldn't let me follow him. Marie felt a chill creep down her spine. If we can find Node K, maybe we can figure out what's drawing them here. Maybe we can stop them. Richard shook his head. Or maybe we'll just make things worse. Maybe, Marie agreed softly. But we have to try. Grandpa spent his whole life chasing this, Dad. He thought there was a way to fight back. We owe it to him, to ourselves, to see if he was right. Richard hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Then with a slow, reluctant nod, he reached for one of the older maps spread out on the table. All right, he murmured. We'll look for Node K. But if things get too dangerous, if there's even a chance we can't handle it, we leave. No arguments. Deal, Marie said firmly. As they pored over the faded map together, tracing out potential locations and landmarks, Marie felt a strange sense of resolve settle over her. They were finally starting to put the pieces together. They weren't alone in this, not anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. But deep in her gut, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far more terrible than they'd ever imagined. Something that was waiting for them just beyond the boundaries of their understanding. Something that knew they were coming. Chapter 7. The Harvester's Purpose. Night had fallen again by the time Marie and Richard reached the farthest edge of the orchard, a place rarely tended and even less frequently visited. The rows of trees grew sparse and wild here, their branches twisted and misshapen. Shadows pooled like dark water beneath the gnarled trunks, and the ground was thick with brambles that clung to their ankles as they walked. Grandpa used to call this place the Old Grove, Richard murmured, his voice barely carrying over the sigh of the wind. Said it was where the orchard first began, back when his father planted the first saplings. He used to bring me here as a kid. Said there was something special about it, something different. Different how? Marie asked, casting a wary glance around. The air felt colder here, sharper, as if the very atmosphere had grown hostile. Richard shrugged, the gesture stiff with unease. Didn't say. Just told me not to wander out here alone at night. A chill settled over Marie. But he came out here, didn't he? After the lights started appearing. Richard nodded grimly. Yeah. Spent hours out here. Brought equipment, took samples. Sometimes he'd come back with scratches all over his arms, like he'd been wrestling with the branches. I think whatever he found out here is what drove him over the edge. They continued deeper into the grove, the trees growing more twisted and alien the farther they went. There was no sign of animal life, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, no call of night birds. It was as if the entire area had been drained of life, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. Marie's hand tightened around the flashlight she was carrying, its beam cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. We need to look for anything unusual. Markings, equipment your grandpa might have left behind, signs of disturbance. Richard nodded and they split up, moving cautiously among the trees. Marie swept her light over the ground, searching for any clue that might reveal where her grandfather had conducted his research. The underbrush was thick with vines and thorns, but here and there she spotted patches of disturbed soil as if someone, or something, had been digging. After a few minutes she paused, her heart skipping a beat. There, half buried beneath a tangle of roots, was a rusted metal box. Kneeling down she tugged it free, dirt crumbling away from its sides. The box was heavy, its surface pitted with rust, but the latch held firm when she pried it open. Inside she found a collection of tools, geological hammers, small vials of strange iridescent liquid, and a stack of old notebooks, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. Carefully she lifted out the notebooks and flipped through them. The handwriting was her grandfather's, neat and meticulous at first, but growing more erratic as the pages went on. Scrawled diagrams filled the margins, sketches of trees, of branching root systems, of strange luminescent shapes hovering above the ground. And then there were the notes written in a tight, frantic script. Anomalous readings at node 𝐓𝐴 vibration frequencies increasing. Soil composition altered. Presence of unidentified compounds. Impact on local ecosystem, unknown. Marie's pulse quickened. Her grandfather hadn't been imagining things. He'd been documenting the changes happening in the orchard, tracking the creatures' activities, trying to understand their purpose. She turned another page and froze. There, in bold letters, was a phrase that sent a jolt of fear through her. They are not harvesting the fruit. They are harvesting the land. What the hell does that mean? She whispered, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more comprehensible. But they didn't. They remained stark and ominous, a warning that echoed in her mind. Marie. Over here. Richard's voice shattered the stillness and Marie jumped to her feet, clutching the notebook. She followed the sound of his voice, weaving between the trees until she found him standing in a small clearing. Look at this, he said, his face pale in the beam of his flashlight. Marie followed his gaze and gasped. The ground in the center of the clearing was scorched and blackened, as if a fire had raged there recently. The soil was cracked and brittle, radiating out from a single point, an unnaturally perfect circle of ash. What is this? She breathed, stepping closer. The air within the clearing felt thick, almost electric, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Node 𝐓𝐴, Richard murmured. It has to be. This is where he was doing his research. Marie crouched down, running her fingers over the edge of the scorched circle. The ash crumbled beneath her touch and a faint, metallic scent filled her nose. What was he doing here? She asked quietly. Richard shook his head. I don't know. But look at the trees around us. Marie lifted her gaze and a shiver ran down her spine. The trees that ringed the clearing were unlike any she'd seen before. Their bark was split and blackened, oozing a thick, dark sap that glowed faintly in the dim light. The branches twisted upward in unnatural spirals, their leaves sparse and brittle. And the ground beneath them was littered with withered, misshapen fruit, plums that had been warped and distorted almost beyond recognition. It's like they've been corrupted, Marie murmured, a sick feeling churning in her gut. Richard nodded grimly. Your grandpa thought these creatures were changing the land, right? Well, maybe this is where it started. Maybe this is ground zero. Marie's gaze drifted back to the center of the clearing, where the circle of ash seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. She could feel it, a strange, almost magnetic pull as if the ground itself were drawing her in. We need to take samples, she said, reaching for her kit. Soil, sap, anything we can get. If I can analyze it, maybe I can figure out what's happening to the trees. Richard watched her in silence as she carefully collected the samples, placing them in sealed containers and labeling them with trembling hands. The clearing seemed to hum with an energy that set her nerves on edge, and every sound, the crunch of leaves, the rustle of branches, felt amplified and threatening. When she finally stood, her kit full, Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "Marie," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you all this sooner. Thought I could protect you. But I see now, this isn't something we can ignore. It's not going to go away." Marie turned to face him, her expression fierce. "We're not running, Dad. We're going to figure this out. Whatever they're doing here, we're going to stop it." Richard nodded slowly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Then let's get back to the house and start analyzing these samples." They turned to leave the clearing, but just as they stepped beyond the circle of ash, a low, thrumming sound filled the air. Marie froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "What's that?" she whispered, glancing at Richard. "I don't know," he replied, his voice tense. "But it's coming from behind us." Slowly they turned, their flashlights sweeping over the clearing. And there, standing in the exact center of the circle, was a figure. A humanoid shape made entirely of light, its body shimmering with the same bluish-white glow as the creatures they'd seen before. Marie's breath caught. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. It simply stood there, watching them with a faceless, expressionless gaze. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through her bones. "Run," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. They turned and sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at their faces, the thrumming sound chasing them all the way back to the edge of the grove. Only when they burst into the open air of the main orchard did the sound finally fade. Gasping for breath, Marie glanced back, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees. But the clearing was empty, the grove silent and still. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Richard replied, his face ashen. "But I think it was watching us. Guarding something." Marie felt a lump rise in her throat, her mind racing. Whatever they were dealing with, it was far more dangerous and far more aware than they'd realized. And they just made contact. Chapter 8. The Neighbor's Demise. The first thing Marie noticed when they pulled into the driveway was the sheriff's car parked at an awkward angle in front of Marv's house. Its headlights were on, casting harsh white beams across the overgrown yard. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach as she spotted the flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance reflecting off the cracked windows. "Something's happened," she murmured, glancing at Richard, who sat rigid in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes locked on the commotion ahead. "Something bad." They climbed out of the truck, the gravel crunching under their boots, and made their way toward the house. A pair of paramedics were just coming down the front steps, their expressions grim. They nodded curtly at Marie and Richard, then continued on to the ambulance, muttering in low voices. "Hey," Richard called out, his voice strained. "What's going on? What happened to Marv?" One of the paramedics paused, glancing over his shoulder. He looked hesitant, almost as if he didn't want to answer, but then he sighed. "It's Marv Connors, right? Neighboring farmer?" "Yes," Richard said quickly. "Is he?" The paramedic shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry. He's gone." Marie felt the world tilt slightly, her breath catching in her throat. "Gone? How?" "He was just fine yesterday." The paramedic hesitated again, then glanced at the sheriff's car. "You'll have to speak with the sheriff about that. All I can say is, it doesn't look natural." "Doesn't look natural?" Richard echoed, his voice rising. "What the hell does that mean?" Before the paramedic could respond, the front door of Marv's house opened and Sheriff Jameson stepped out, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He looked tired, deep lines etched into his tired face, and his usually confident stride was weighed down with something like resignation. "Richard, Marie," he greeted them, his voice tight. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "What happened, Sheriff?" Marie asked, stepping forward. The paramedic said Marv's dead. "How did it happen?" Jameson's jaw tightened and he glanced over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. Then he sighed and stepped down onto the porch, lowering his voice. "We're still figuring that out," he admitted. "But whatever killed Marv, it wasn't something I've ever seen before. His body was twisted, contorted in ways that don't make any sense." Richard let out a low curse, running a hand through his hair. "Twisted? Jesus, Jim, what are you saying?" The sheriff shook his head slowly. "I don't know. We won't know for sure until the autopsy, but I've never seen a body do that on its own. It's like something crushed him from the inside out." He paused, then added quietly, "And there's more. The area around him, it was scorched. Like it had been hit by a bolt of lightning, but there wasn't a storm last night. No lightning. No power surge. Just Marv, dead in the middle of his living room with half the house looking like it's been fried." A cold dread washed over Marie. The memory of the glowing figure in the clearing flashed in her mind, the way it had simply stood there watching. Had they somehow provoked it? Had it followed them back? Richard opened his mouth to say something, but the sheriff held up a hand, his gaze hardening. "Don't say it," Jameson warned. "Don't start with the stories about lights in the sky or whatever else you've got up your sleeve. I'm trying to help you here, Richard. The last thing we need is a panic. Marv was a strange old coot and most people are gonna write this off as some kind of accident or natural death. Let's keep it that way." Marie bristled. "You're asking us to ignore what's happening? People are dying, Sheriff. And we both know Marv wasn't the first." Jameson's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "I know something's happening. I don't like it, but I know. But until I have something concrete, something I can show people that won't make them think I'm the one losing my mind, I can't do much more than keep an eye on things." Richard stepped forward, his face tight with anger. "So you're just going to sweep this under the rug? Pretend it's nothing?" "I'm saying we keep it quiet until we know what we're dealing with," Jameson shot back. "For now, the official cause of death is unknown, pending an autopsy. That's all anyone outside this yard needs to know." Marie bit her lip, forcing herself to take a deep breath. "Sheriff, if you're serious about wanting to help, we need to show you something." Jameson's brow furrowed. "Show me what?" "Come to our place tonight," Marie said, her gaze steady. "We have footage. Evidence of what's been happening in the orchard. It's not much, but it's enough to prove we're not making this up. Whatever killed Marv, it's not human and it's not natural." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his gaze searching hers. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "All right," he said finally. "I'll come by after dark once I've finished up here. But I'm warning you, if this turns out to be some wild goose chase, I'm not gonna be able to help you. I'm sticking my neck out as it is." "It's not a wild goose chase," Richard muttered. "You'll see." With a curt nod, the sheriff turned and headed back toward the house, his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying a heavy burden. Marie watched him go, her heart hammering in her chest. This was their chance, maybe their only chance, to get someone else to believe them. "Do you think he'll help us?" Richard asked quietly, his gaze still fixed on the front door. "I don't know," Marie admitted. "But we have to try. Whatever killed Marv, it's getting more aggressive. We need to find out why." They left Marv's property in silence, the drive back to the farmhouse feeling longer and darker than usual. When they finally arrived, Marie went straight to the surveillance room, pulling up the footage from the previous night. The screens flickered to life, showing the usual images of swaying branches and shifting shadows. But then, just after the moment she and Richard had fled the clearing, the cameras captured something extraordinary. The center of the scorched circle in the clearing began to shimmer, a faint glow radiating from the ground. The glow grew brighter until it coalesced into a single humanoid figure, its form almost translucent as if made of pure energy. It stood in the center of the clearing for several long seconds, then slowly raised an arm. The movement sent ripples of light spreading outward, and the trees around it began to tremble, their leaves rustling violently. The figure lowered its arm and the ripples faded. The trees went still again and the figure vanished, leaving the clearing dark and empty. "What is it doing?" Richard breathed, his eyes wide. "I don't know," Marie murmured, leaning closer to the screen. "But whatever it is, it's like it's controlling the orchard. Manipulating it somehow." "Manipulating it for what?" Richard asked, his voice tight with fear. Marie shook her head. "Maybe it's testing the soil. Or maybe it's marking territory. But the way the trees reacted, it's like they were responding to it. Like it was giving them orders," Richard whispered, a shudder running through him. Marie nodded slowly, her mind racing. The creatures weren't just stealing the fruit or damaging the trees. They were doing something far more deliberate, something that involved the land itself. And now they'd made their first move outside the orchard, killing Marv in a way that defied all logic. "We need to be careful tonight," she said softly. "If the sheriff sees this, he might help us. But if those things show up again..." Richard could feel a knot in his stomach growing tighter. "We could end up like Marv." Marie nodded, her gaze never leaving the screen. The figure's presence had been brief, but it had left an indelible mark on the clearing, and on their minds. "Whatever they're doing, it's escalating," she murmured. "And if we don't stop it soon..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a noose. If they didn't stop it soon, there would be more than just plums and trees at stake. Their entire world could be next. Chapter 9. Escalation. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the sheriff's car pulled into the driveway of the Mason farmhouse. Marie watched from the porch as Sheriff Jameson climbed out, the weight of his skepticism apparent in the cautious way he moved. His broad frame seemed more hunched, as if some unseen force had pressed down on his shoulders, and the usually sharp gaze beneath his hat was clouded with worry. "Evening," he greeted curtly as he made his way up the porch steps. I hope you've got something good to show me. Marv's death has already got folks talking, and the last thing we need is more trouble. Come on in, Sheriff, Richard said gruffly, holding the screen door open. We've got something that'll explain everything. Or at least it'll show you we're not making this up. Jameson gave him a wary look, then nodded and stepped inside. Marie led him to the surveillance room, where the screens were already displaying the footage from the previous night. She could feel the tension radiating off the sheriff as he folded his arms and watched. All right, she said, taking a deep breath. This is what we recorded last night, just after we got back from the old grove. She hit play and the footage flickered to life. The sheriff's expression was unreadable as the scene unfolded. The shimmering light in the clearing, the emergence of the figure, the strange movements that sent ripples through the trees. What the hell is that? He muttered, leaning closer to the screen. Is this some kind of trick? It's not a trick, Sheriff, Marie replied firmly. We saw it with our own eyes. And it's not just this one incident. These things, whatever they are, they've been showing up for weeks. Stealing the fruit, damaging the trees, and now they're killing people. Jameson stared at the screen in silence, his mouth a tight line. Then he straightened, turning to face them both. You said it's been going on for weeks? He asked slowly. Months, actually, Richard admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't want to believe it at first. But they've been getting more aggressive, more bold. They're not just stealing plums. They're changing the land. Like they're trying to turn it into something else. Jameson glanced back at the screen, his brow furrowing. Changing it into what? Marie shook her head. We don't know. But it's not just the orchard that's being affected. The soil's changing, the trees are mutating, and, well, you saw what happened to Marv. If we don't do something, it could spread beyond our land. The sheriff's gaze hardened. Spread? You're saying this contamination or whatever it is could move beyond your property? Yes, Marie said quietly. And I think it's already started. Marv's land is right next to ours, and whatever killed him, it came from our orchard. We saw one of these creatures last night, right after we discovered something called 𝐓𝐡𝐞. A place where they seem to be focusing their activity. Jameson's face turned pale, but he quickly schooled his features. So what do you want me to do? Call in the National Guard? Tell the governor there's a bunch of glowing ghosts in the orchard? Richard stepped forward, his voice steady. We need to contain this. I know how it sounds, but we've got to find a way to stop them from spreading. We need to go back to the old grove, back to 𝐓𝐡𝐞, and see if we can disrupt whatever they're doing. Jameson eyed him skeptically. And what exactly are you planning to do if you go back there? Talk to them. We'll bring equipment, Marie said quickly, cutting in before Richard could respond. Cameras, sensors, anything we can use to record and analyze their activity. And if we can get a sample, a real physical sample of one of these things, we might be able to find out what they are and what they want. The sheriff ran a hand over his face, shaking his head slowly. You two are crazy, you know that? Maybe, Richard admitted. But we're also the only ones who know what's happening. If we don't do something, who will? Jameson stared at them for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then he let out a long, slow breath. Fine, he muttered. But I'm coming with you. And if I see anything, that puts us in danger, we're pulling out. No arguments. Agreed, Marie said, a wave of relief washing over her. We leave in half an hour. They spent the next 30 minutes gathering supplies. Marie packed her field kit with sample containers, test tubes, and vials, while Richard loaded a backpack with extra batteries, cables, and portable lights. The sheriff, for his part, checked his flashlight and his sidearm, a grim look on his face. The drive back to the old grove was tense, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. The sheriff's cruiser followed close behind their truck, its headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The road seemed longer tonight, the trees on either side looming larger, their branches twisted and reaching like skeletal arms. When they finally arrived at the grove, Marie felt her heart begin to race. The clearing looked different now, more ominous. A thick, roiling mist clung to the ground, swirling in strange patterns around the bases of the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of charred wood and something else, something acrid and metallic. Stay close, she murmured as they moved toward the clearing, the sheriff's flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Richard carried a larger, more powerful floodlight, which he set up on a tripod at the edge of the clearing. Keep the light on the center, Richard muttered. If that thing shows up again, I want to see it. Jameson nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his gun as he scanned the darkness. Let's make this quick. They worked in tense silence, setting up the cameras and sensors around the clearing, focusing on the charred circle at the center. Marie felt the hair on her arms stand on end as she moved closer to the scorched ground. The air around it felt charged, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. This is where it appeared last night, she said softly, adjusting one of the sensors. It stood right here and it looked like it was giving orders to the trees. Orders? Jameson echoed, his brow furrowing. Marie nodded. I know it sounds crazy, but the trees reacted to it. They moved almost like they were obeying. Jameson glanced around, his eyes narrowing. Well, let's hope they don't obey anything tonight. Suddenly the air seemed to thrum with a low, vibrating hum. Marie froze, her gaze snapping to the center of the clearing. The sound grew louder, reverberating through her bones, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Get back, Richard hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the circle. They stumbled backward, the floodlight flickering as the hum reached a deafening pitch. The mist thickened, swirling violently, and the trees around the clearing began to shake, their branches creaking and groaning. Then from the center of the circle the light flared, blinding, brilliant, filling the clearing with a harsh, unnatural glow. Marie shielded her eyes, her heart pounding wildly. "Sheriff," she shouted over the roar. "Get back to the truck." But Jameson didn't move. He stood frozen, his gaze locked on the light. And then slowly the glowing figure began to take shape once more. Its form was clearer this time, more defined. A humanoid silhouette that shimmered with a strange, crystalline quality. The sheriff's mouth dropped open, his face a mask of shock and fear. What is that?" The figure tilted its head as if studying them. Then it lifted an arm and the light around it pulsed, sending a wave of energy rippling through the clearing. The floodlight exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging them into darkness. "Move!" Richard shouted, shoving Marie toward the edge of the clearing. They ran, the sheriff stumbling behind them as the trees seemed to come alive, their branches twisting and lashing out like whipcords. Marie ducked and weaved, her heart hammering in her chest as she sprinted toward the truck. Behind them, the clearing erupted in a symphony of creaking wood and crackling energy. The ground shook violently, and Marie glanced over her shoulder to see the figure standing in the center of the clearing, its light growing brighter, hotter, until it seemed to consume everything around it. They reached the truck just as a deafening crack split the air. Marie flinched, throwing herself to the ground as a massive tree toppled, crashing to the earth in a shower of dirt and splintered wood. "Go, go, go!" Richard shouted, scrambling into the driver's seat. The sheriff dove into his cruiser and they peeled out of the grove, tires kicking up gravel and dirt as they tore down the road. Marie's breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse thundering in her ears. "What was that?" Jameson's voice crackled over the radio. "What the hell was that?" A knot in Marie's throat tightened as she anxiously peered down the road ahead. "I don't know," she whispered. "But it knows we're here now." Silence fell over the radio and Marie shivered. Whatever was happening in the old grove, it wasn't just an invasion. It was a war. And they'd just stepped into the front lines. Chapter 10. Descent into Madness. The Mason farmhouse felt suffocatingly small after their encounter in the grove. Marie sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the empty mug in front of her. The lights in the house flickered intermittently, as if the surge of energy from the clearing had bled into the electrical system. Richard paced in tight circles around the room, muttering under his breath, while Sheriff Jameson leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze distant and haunted. "We can't go back there," Jameson said flatly, breaking the silence. "That thing, whatever it is, it's not something we can fight." "Then what do you suggest we do?" Richard snapped, his voice harsh and ragged. "Pack up and leave like cowards? Let it take our land, our home, everything?" "I don't know," Jameson shouted back, his frustration boiling over. "But if we go back we'll end up like Marv. Or worse. Did you see what it did to those trees? It's like they were alive." "They were alive," Marie whispered, her voice strained. She glanced up at the men, her hands trembling as she reached for one of the sample containers she'd managed to grab before they fled the grove. "Look at this." She unscrewed the lid and held it out. Inside, a small withered leaf sat suspended in a clear solution. Its edges were curled and blackened, but faint veins of bluish light pulsed through it, like blood vessels in diseased flesh. "What the hell?" Jameson breathed, leaning closer. "I took it from one of the trees in the clearing," Marie explained quietly. "It's still reacting. Whatever that thing is, it's altered the very cells of the tree. I think it's fusing with them somehow. Like it's trying to convert the trees into something else." "Convert them into what?" Richard demanded, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "I don't know," Marie admitted. "But this isn't just about the trees. The land itself is changing. The soil, the plants, everything. If it spreads, it could affect the entire valley. Maybe beyond that. So we leave," Jameson said, his tone firm. "We get the hell out of here and call in the government, the military, someone who can handle this. It's not our fight. It is our fight," Richard growled, his fists clenching. "This is our home. We can't just abandon it. And we can't fight that thing," the sheriff shot back. "Whatever it is, it's way beyond anything we've ever dealt with." "I'm not leaving," Richard said stubbornly, turning away from the sheriff. "I'll burn every damn tree to the ground before I let them have it." Marie's heart sank. "Dead no. That won't work." We saw what happened when Grandpa tried that. Richard shook his head violently. No, I've got to do something. I can't just sit here and... The lights in the house flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Damn it. Richard swore, his voice shaking. What now? A soft hum filled the air, rising from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. The sound vibrated through the walls, the furniture, even through Marie's bones. It was the same hum they'd heard in the clearing, the same one that had preceded the creature's appearance. It's here, Jameson whispered, his voice tight with fear. He reached for his gun, his fingers trembling. No, Marie murmured, shaking her head. It's not here. It's in the ground. What do you mean? Richard asked, frowning. The land, Marie said, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. It's using the land to channel its energy. That's why it's so strong. That's why the trees are changing. It's connected to the soil, to the roots. The hum grew louder, rattling the dishes in the cabinets. Marie stumbled back, her heart pounding. They had to get out of the house. They had to. A sudden, piercing scream tore through the air. It wasn't human. It was high-pitched, shrill, like metal scraping against metal. Marie clapped her hands over her ears, gritting her teeth against the sound. Richard dropped to his knees, his face twisted in pain. What is that? Jameson shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Marie struggled to her feet, the scream reverberating through her skull. It's coming from outside. She bolted for the front door, flinging it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the charred scent of burning wood and something pungent, something that made her eyes water and her throat tighten. She stumbled out onto the porch, her heart seizing at the sight that met her eyes. The orchard was ablaze with light. Not fire, but a cold, unnatural glow that pulsed through the trees like veins of liquid metal. The branches writhed and twisted, the trunks bending and contorting as if struggling to uproot themselves. The ground seemed to shift beneath the trees, a low, undulating motion that sent ripples through the earth. And in the center of the chaos, standing at the edge of the clearing where they had faced the creature, was Richard's beloved farmhouse plum tree, taller and more gnarled than ever, its bark splitting open to reveal a web of glowing tendrils that burrowed deep into the earth. What is it doing? Richard gasped, staggering out beside her. It's drawing energy, Marie whispered, horror dawning on her. It's using the trees as conduits. It's spreading its influence through the roots like a virus. But why? Richard demanded, his voice breaking. Why now? Marie's gaze drifted to the ground at the base of the tree. The soil was dark and wet, almost black, and it shimmered with that same eerie light. The air around the tree crackled with energy, the hum building to a deafening crescendo. It's feeding, she realized, her stomach turning. It's feeding off the land, using the trees to spread itself. And if it keeps going, it'll take everything, Jameson finished grimly. The whole orchard. Maybe more. We have to stop it, Marie said, her voice shaking. We have to cut off its connection to the land. Destroy the roots, the source. If we can sever the link. How? Richard interrupted, his voice ragged. How do we do that? Her mind was racing as Marie took a deep breath. We need to find the main root system. If we can destroy it, maybe we can disrupt whatever it's doing. Jameson shook his head, his face pale in the glow of the writhing trees. And how do we find that? Marie's gaze shifted to the tree at the center of the clearing. The tree that had always stood out from the others. The tree that her grandfather had spent so much time studying. Node K, she whispered. It's the center of all this. The place where everything began. That tree, it's the source. We have to get to its roots and destroy them. Richard's face twisted in anguish. But that's our tree. It's been here since... I know, Marie said softly, placing a hand on his arm. But it's not the same tree anymore. Something else now. Something dangerous. Richard looked at her, his eyes filling with pain and fury. Then he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. Fine. Let's do it. Let's end this. They gathered what they could, axes, shovels, and a few cans of gasoline from the shed. The sheriff stayed close, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they made their way back toward the clearing. The air crackled with energy, and Marie felt a prickling sensation along her skin, as if she were standing too close to a live wire. The tree loomed ahead, its branches thrashing wildly, the glowing tendrils beneath its bark pulsating with power. The hum filled the air, vibrating through Marie's chest, making it hard to breathe. Be careful, she warned, glancing back at the sheriff and her father. We don't know how it'll react. Let's not give it the chance, Jameson muttered, hefting the axe. They spread out around the base of the tree, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Marie dug her shovel into the earth, gritting her teeth as she worked to expose the roots. The soil was dense and dark, almost oily, and it clung to the blade of the shovel as if reluctant to let go. Hurry, Richard urged, his voice strained. It's getting stronger. Marie could feel it too, The energy building, the air growing thicker, heavier. She shoveled faster, throwing dirt aside as she unearthed the first of the thick, gnarled roots. The root glowed faintly, the same eerie light that pulsed through the tree's bark. "Got one," she shouted, glancing at Jameson. "Me too," he called back, his axe raised. "Do it," she yelled. Jameson swung the axe down hard, the blade biting into the glowing root. A burst of light erupted from the point of impact, and the ground shook violently. The hum turned into a piercing shriek, the tree's branches lashing out like a wounded animal. "Keep going," Marie screamed, hacking at another root with all her strength. The tree shuddered, its bark splitting open to reveal more of the glowing tendrils. The light intensified, blinding, searing. Marie could feel the heat radiating off the roots, burning through her gloves, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Another swing. Another root severed. The tree let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the clearing. The light flared, then began to flicker, dimming and brightening in rapid succession. "It's working," Richard shouted, his voice triumphant. But then, with a final thunderous crack, the ground beneath the tree split open, and a surge of energy exploded outward, sending Marie and the others flying back. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her. Dazed, she struggled to sit up, her vision swimming. The tree was collapsing, its branches curling inward, the light fading from its bark. The earth around it seemed to collapse, pulling the tree down into a gaping chasm that yawned wider and wider. "What's happening?" Jameson yelled, scrambling to his feet. "It's dying," Marie gasped, staggering upright. The ground trembled violently and the chasm widened, a sickening, gaping maw that swallowed the tree whole. The remaining light flared one last time, then winked out, plunging the clearing into darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the trembling stopped. The clearing was silent. The trees were still. Marie stared at the empty space where the massive plum tree had stood, her heart pounding. "It's gone," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. It wasn't gone. It had just moved deeper. Chapter 11. The Final Confrontation. The aftermath of the collapse left the orchard shrouded in an eerie silence. Marie stood at the edge of the massive sinkhole where the plum tree had been, staring into the yawning darkness below. The air was thick with the scent of scorched earth and ozone, and a faint, unsettling vibration seemed to pulse up from the depths of the chasm. Whatever they'd done to the tree, it had only forced the entity, or whatever force was controlling it, to retreat underground. "What now?" Richard asked, his voice a low, broken whisper. He looked frail in the weak moonlight, his face smeared with dirt and streaked with sweat. "Is it over?" "No," Marie murmured, shaking her head. "It's not over. It's just changed its position. We didn't kill it, Dad. We just disrupted its current form. Whatever this thing is, it's moved somewhere deeper, somewhere it feels safer." Sheriff Jameson stepped up beside them, his expression grim. He'd shed his usual calm, collected demeanor, his face now tight with fear and uncertainty. "If it's gone underground, that means it's probably connected to the entire root system, right? Which means it could come up anywhere." Marie nodded slowly. "Yes. And now it knows we're a threat. It's going to protect itself. We need to find out exactly where it's gone and finish this, or it'll spread through the valley." Jameson sighed, his shoulders slumping. "How do we even begin to track it? This is way out of our league, Marie." Marie stared down into the dark abyss of the sinkhole, her heart hammering in her chest. "I have an idea," she said slowly. "But it's risky." Richard glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We go down there." "What?" Richard and Jameson exclaimed in unison. "Hear me out," Marie said quickly. "The tree collapsing, whatever force was in it, was channeled down into the ground. Still active down there, I can feel it. If we go down into the root system, we might be able to find where it's concentrated and destroy it for good," Richard finished, a gleam of hope and desperation flickering in his eyes. "Or we'll die trying," Jameson muttered, shaking his head. "Are you crazy, Marie? You saw what it did to the trees, to Marv. It's too dangerous." Marie met his gaze, her expression fierce. "It's always been dangerous, Sheriff. But if we don't stop it now, it'll only get worse. It's already spreading. If we don't find the source and put an end to it, it could infect the entire valley, maybe even further. This is our only chance." Jameson stared at her, his jaw clenched. Then he looked down at the sinkhole, his face pale and drawn. "Fine," he said finally, his voice rough. "But I'm coming with you. No arguments." "Me too," Richard added, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm not letting you go down there alone." Marie felt a surge of gratitude and fear. She nodded, squeezing her father's hand briefly. "Hey, we do this together." They gathered what supplies they could, flashlights, rope and a few makeshift weapons. Marie strapped on her field kit, her fingers trembling as she double-checked the vials and syringes. If they were going to face the creature directly, she wanted to have a way to collect a sample. Something tangible they could use to understand and hopefully neutralize it. The climb down into the sinkhole was treacherous. The earth crumbled beneath their feet, sending rocks and dirt skittering into the darkness below. Marie's heart pounded as she lowered herself down, the rope cutting into her hands. The hole seemed to descend forever, a dark tunnel that twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the ground. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marie's boots hit solid ground. She looked up, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. Richard and the sheriff landed beside her, their breaths coming in short, harsh gasps. Where are we?" Richard murmured, glancing around. The tunnel they'd landed in was wide and low, the walls lined with thick, gnarled roots that glowed faintly in the dark. A strange, phosphorescent moss clung to the surfaces, pulsing with a sickly green light. The air was thick and humid, and the same hum they'd heard above ground reverberated through the space, making Marie's skin crawl. "It's a root system," Marie whispered, running her fingers over the glowing moss. "But it's more than that. It's like a neural network connected to the entire orchard. Maybe even further." "Which way?" Jameson asked, his voice tight. Marie closed her eyes, focusing on the vibrations under her feet. The energy was stronger here, more concentrated. It seemed to pulse and shift as if trying to draw her in. "There," she said, pointing down one of the tunnels. "The energy's stronger that way. That's where we'll find it." They moved cautiously through the tunnel, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating as they went deeper, and the roots around them pulsed and writhed as if sensing their presence. "It's getting closer," Richard muttered, his voice strained. "I can feel it." Marie nodded, her mouth dry. She could feel it too, a presence, a force that pressed down on them like a physical weight. It was as if the very ground was alive, watching them, waiting. Then they rounded a bend and the tunnel opened up into a massive chamber. Marie gasped, the sight before her stealing the breath from her lungs. The chamber was immense, its walls lined with thick pulsating roots that converged at the center, where a massive twisted structure of wood and vine rose up from the ground. The structure glowed with a brilliant, searing light, the same bluish-white energy that had radiated from the creature above ground. But it wasn't just light. The structure was moving, shifting, the roots curling and uncurling like the tendrils of a living organism. And at its heart, suspended in a cocoon of roots and bark, was something that pulsed and throbbed like a heartbeat. What is that?" Jameson breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's the source," Marie whispered, her eyes wide. "The core of whatever this is. The tree above was just an extension, a surface manifestation. This is the true form. The real creature. It's alive," Richard murmured, his voice filled with awe and horror. "All of it. The roots, the trees, the ground, it's all part of the same organism." Marie nodded slowly, her gaze locked on the pulsing core. "Yes. And if we destroy it, we destroy the entire system. Everything it's infected." "How?" Jameson asked, his voice tight. "How do we destroy something like that?" Marie glanced at the sheriff, then at her father. "We overload it," she said softly. "It's drawing energy from the land, using the roots to channel it. If we can sever those connections, disrupt its control over the roots, we might be able to force it to implode." "And how do we do that?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "We burn it," Marie said, pulling a can of gasoline from her bag. "We burn the roots, cut off its supply, and force it to use up all its energy trying to save itself." Jameson stared at her, then nodded slowly. "Let's do it." They moved quickly, spreading the gasoline around the base of the core, soaking the roots in the flammable liquid. The tendrils twitched and writhed as the liquid soaked in, and the hum in the air grew louder, more frantic. "It knows what we're doing," Richard murmured, his eyes wide. "Then we'd better hurry," Marie said, pulling a lighter from her pocket. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. Then she flicked it on, the small flame dancing in the dark. "Now," she shouted, tossing the lighter onto the gasoline-soaked roots. The flames roared to life, spreading rapidly up the roots. The core let out a high-pitched screech, the sound piercing and inhuman. The ground shook violently and the roots thrashed wildly, the energy within them flaring brighter, hotter. "Back up," Jameson yelled, grabbing Richard's arm and dragging him away from the burning roots. The fire spread, consuming the roots, racing up the walls of the chamber. The core pulsed erratically, its light flickering, dimming. The screeching grew louder and the chamber began to collapse, chunks of earth and stone falling from the ceiling. "Go!" Marie screamed, shoving her father toward the tunnel. They ran, the ground trembling beneath their feet, the walls cracking and crumbling. The heat from the flames scorched their skin, and the air filled with smoke and ash. They burst out of the tunnel just as the chamber behind them collapsed completely, the sound of the core's death throes echoing through the earth. Marie stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, her heart hammering wildly. The ground beneath them shuddered one last time, then went still. It's over, she whispered, staring back at the smoke-filled tunnel. We did it. Jameson nodded slowly, his face pale. Yeah, we did. Richard sagged against the wall, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion and relief. Is it really over? Marie took a deep breath, then nodded. Yes, it's over. The core is gone. The roots are severed. The land will heal now. It'll take time, but it'll be okay. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they'd done settling over them. Then slowly they turned and made their way back up the tunnel, the air cool and clean around them. The orchard was still when they emerged, the night air crisp and clear. The trees stood silent and unmoving, their branches no longer twisted or writhing. Marie looked up at the stars, a deep aching sense of relief filling her chest. They'd done it. They'd stopped the invasion. The land was safe. But as they turned to leave the orchard, a faint, almost imperceptible hum echoed through the night air, a sound that sent a shiver down Marie's spine. She glanced back at the grove, her heart sinking. It wasn't completely gone. It was never completely gone. Somewhere, deep beneath the ground, the last remnants of the entity stirred. Chapter 12. Aftermath. The orchard was eerily quiet in the early dawn light. The trees, which were once animated and writhing with a malevolent energy, now stood still and silent, their branches weighed down by a heavy stillness that was both serene and ominous. The ground beneath Marie's boots was solid, no longer pulsing or trembling with hidden power. But there was something wrong about the calm. Something that kept her heart racing and her mind alert despite the exhaustion that weighed her down like lead. It's too quiet, Richard murmured beside her, his voice rough from lack of sleep and the lingering effects of the smoke they'd inhaled. He glanced around the orchard, his eyes darting nervously from one tree to the next. It's like they're waiting. Marie nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping the rows of trees. Maybe it's just over. Sheriff Jameson finished, stepping up on her other side. His face was haggard, deep lines etched into his skin. The encounter underground had left its mark on him, stripping away the bravado he'd worn like armor. He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. Doesn't feel over. No, Marie agreed softly, her gaze lingering on the scorched clearing where the sinkhole had swallowed the core. It doesn't. But what more could they do? They'd destroyed the source, severed the entity's control over the roots and the land. They'd burned the core, watched as the creature's very essence was consumed by the flames. Yet, something still lingered. An echo, a whisper of energy that thrummed beneath the ground just out of reach. We should go back to the house, Richard said quietly, rubbing a hand over his face. Get cleaned up. Figure out our next move. Jameson shook his head. Our next move? Richard, we destroyed the damn thing. If there's anything left, it's probably buried miles beneath us. What more can we do? Marie gulped, her throat constricted. She didn't have an answer. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her shaky and nauseous. They were running on fumes, all of them. How much longer could they keep fighting a war they barely understood? Let's go inside, she murmured, turning away from the clearing. We need rest. We can regroup later. Reluctantly, they made their way back to the farmhouse, the morning sun casting long shadows across the orchard. Richard lagged behind, his shoulders hunched, his gaze distant. Marie watched him, a pang of worry tightening in her chest. He'd lost so much already, his land, his sanity, his sense of safety. No. Dad, she called softly, waiting for him to catch up. You okay? Richard nodded absently, but his eyes remained fixed on the trees. Just tired, he muttered. Really tired. Marie sighed, squeezing his arm gently. Me too. Let's get some rest. They stepped onto the porch and Marie paused, glancing back at the orchard one last time. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches unmoving in the still air. A shiver ran down her spine, but she pushed it aside, following Richard and Jameson inside. The house was a mess. The surge of energy from the core's destruction had left deep cracks in the walls and shattered several windows. Dust coated every surface, and a faint smell of burnt wood lingered in the air. But it was safe. For now at least. I'll make some coffee, Richard mumbled, shuffling toward the kitchen. Marie nodded, dropping into a chair at the dining table. Her muscles ached, her head pounded, and every nerve in her body screamed for sleep. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. What now? Jameson asked quietly, lowering himself into the chair across from her. I don't know, Marie admitted. We can monitor the orchard, see if anything changes. Maybe run some more tests on the soil. But it feels like a waiting game now. Whatever's left down there, it's not going to come out easily. Great, Jameson muttered, rubbing his temples. So we just sit around and hope it stays buried? Unless you have a better idea, Marie replied, forcing a weak smile. The sheriff didn't respond. He just shook his head slowly, staring down at his hands. We lost Marv, he murmured after a long pause. And half the other farmers have already packed up and left. Even if we win this thing, what's left for anyone? Marie didn't have an answer. She stared at the cracked, dirty surface of the table, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. Then from the kitchen came a soft, almost inaudible sound. A hum. Low and rhythmic, like the purr of an engine idling beneath the earth. Her head shot up, her heart leaping into her throat. Dad, she called, her voice tight with sudden fear. There was no response. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards, sending shivers up her spine. She exchanged a panicked look with Jameson, then jumped to her feet, rushing toward the kitchen. Dad, she shouted, rounding the corner. Richard stood at the counter, staring down at a small, empty vial in his hand. The residue from the core's roots glowed faintly inside, casting a sickly blue light across his face. He didn't look up as Marie approached, his gaze distant and glassy. Dad, what are you doing? She whispered, dread clawing at her chest. I had to know, Richard murmured, his voice hollow. Had to see if it was really gone. If it was really dead. What are you talking about? Marie demanded, reaching out to touch his arm. Dad, put that down. Richard shook his head slowly, a sad, broken smile tugging at his lips. It's still here, Marie. Inside me. I can feel it. It's whispering. No, Marie breathed, her blood turning to ice. No. You didn't. I touched it back in the grove, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. When you weren't looking. Just a little piece of it. But I thought I could understand it. Control it. But it's too strong. The vial slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. The glow from the residue dimmed, then went dark. Dad, what did you do? Marie choked out, tears blurring her vision. Richard turned to her, his eyes burning with that same eerie, bluish-white light. I tried to save us, he whispered. But it's inside me now. It's spreading. No. Marie screamed, grabbing his shoulders. We'll get help. We'll. Richard staggered back, clutching his head. It's too late, he gasped, his voice twisted with pain. It's using me. Trying to take control. You have to. His body jerked violently, his limbs convulsing. The glow in his eyes flared brighter, spreading down his neck, his chest. Marie watched in horror as tendrils of light crept across his skin, pulsating with a rhythm that matched the hum in the air. Get back. Jameson shouted, rushing forward and grabbing Marie's arm. We have to get out of here. No. Marie cried, struggling against his grip. Dad, please. Go, Richard whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. Get out, while you can. Then he crumpled to the floor, his body going limp. Dad. Marie screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. The light dimmed, flickered, then slowly faded. Richard lay still, his face pale, his eyes closed. The hum in the air quieted, then ceased altogether. Is he? Jameson whispered, his voice trembling. Marie reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched her father's neck, feeling for a pulse. He was alive. But only just. Help me get him up, she choked out, tears streaming down her face. We have to get him out of here. No. Marie cried, struggling against his grip. Dad, please. Go, Richard whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. Get out, while you can. Then he crumpled to the floor, his body going limp. Dad. Marie screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. The light dimmed, flickered, then slowly faded. Richard lay still, his face pale, his eyes closed. The hum in the air quieted, then ceased altogether. Is he? Jameson whispered, his voice trembling. Marie reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched her father's neck, feeling for a pulse. He was alive. But only just. Help me get him up, she choked out, tears streaming down her face. We have to get him out of here. They lifted Richard's limp form between them, dragging him toward the door. The house felt cold, empty. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows lengthening and deepening. He's going to be okay, Marie whispered, more to herself than to Jameson. We'll find a way. We'll. A soft whisper filled the air. A voice, faint and distant, carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed. It's not over. Marie froze, her blood running cold. The voice, it was her father's. But it was different. Hollow. Alien. Go, she screamed, shoving Jameson forward. Run. They burst out of the house, stumbling down the porch steps. Behind them, the windows flared with light, bright, searing, unnatural. The hum returned, louder than before, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Into the car. Jameson shouted, yanking the door open. They piled in, Marie cradling Richard's head in her lap as Jameson started the engine. The car roared to life and they sped down the driveway, leaving the farmhouse and the orchard behind. Marie glanced back, her heart aching. The house was ablaze with light, the same terrible glow that had consumed the core. And in the center of it, standing on the porch, was Richard's silhouette, tall and still, his eyes burning with that inhuman light. "Dad," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. Then the house exploded. The shockwave rocked the car, sending it skidding across the road. Marie screamed, clutching Richard's limp body as debris rained down around them. The car came to a stop and she looked back, her heart breaking. The farmhouse was gone. The orchard was a blazing inferno of light and fire. But through the flames she could see it, the shape of something massive, something twisted and monstrous, rising from the earth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The entity had found its new host, and it was coming for them.